Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin our journey together into this timeless story of faith and courage, I want to take a moment to connect with you. Wherever you are in the world tonight, how has your day been? Perhaps you're settling in as the evening draws near, or maybe you're starting your morning with this gentle retelling. Whether it's midnight where you are, or the sun is just beginning to rise, know that you're exactly where you need to be. I'm curious about where this story is finding you tonight. Are you listening from a cozy bedroom in North America? Perhaps watching the stars appear through your window? Or maybe you're in Europe, beginning a peaceful morning with this tale. Perhaps you're in Asia, Africa, Australia, or anywhere else across our beautiful world. Wherever you are, you're part of our global Sacred Slumber family, and we're so grateful to have you here. If this is your first time joining us, or if you've been with us before, we invite you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber, where we bring you gentle Bible stories and peaceful reflections designed to encourage your heart and strengthen your faith. Now let's settle in together as we journey to ancient Israel, to a valley where faith would triumph over fear, and where a young shepherd boy would show the world that with God all things are possible. The golden sun rises slowly over the valley of Elah, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. The air is crisp with morning dew, and a gentle breeze carries the scent of wild flowers that dot the hillsides. This valley, nestled between rolling hills covered with olive trees and scattered stones, would soon become the stage for one of history's most remarkable displays of faith. On the eastern ridge, the armies of Israel have made their camp. Hundreds of tents stretch across the hillside, their fabric fluttering softly in the morning breeze. Smoke rises from cooking fires where soldiers prepare their simple breakfast of bread and olives. The men move quietly, their faces etched with concern, their eyes constantly drawn to the valley below and the opposite hill. For across the valley, on the western ridge, stands another camp. The Philistines have pitched their tents there, their bronze weapons glinting in the early light. These are seasoned warriors, confident in their strength, their numbers, and their champion who has struck terror into the hearts of Israel's army for 40 long days. Between these two armies lies the valley itself, a stretch of land that seems to hold its breath in anticipation. The grass grows green here, watered by a small brook that winds its way through the centre of the valley, its waters singing softly over smooth stones. It's a peaceful place, this valley, seemingly too beautiful for the conflict that's about to unfold. But it's here, in this quiet valley, that we find a young man who will change everything. His name is David, and he's not a soldier at all. He's a shepherd from the small town of Bethlehem, the youngest of 8 brothers. While his older brothers serve in King Saul's army, David tends his father's sheep on the hillsides near his home. David has olive skin bronzed by countless hours under the Palestinian sun, and eyes that sparkle with life, an unwavering trust in the God of Israel. His hands, though young, are strong from years of guiding sheep, playing his harp and practicing with his simple shepherd's sling. He's small in stature compared to the warriors in both camps, but there's something different about David, something that sets him apart. It's not his size or his strength, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that the God who created the heavens and earth is also the God who watches over him as he watches over his sheep. As the sun climbs higher, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, a stirring begins in both camps. The day's challenge is about to begin, and David, though he doesn't know it yet, is about to step into a moment that will echo through eternity. For 39 days, the same terrifying scene has played out in the valley of Elah. As the morning sun reaches its full strength, a massive figure emerges from the Philistine camp and strides down the hillside toward the valley floor. This is Goliath of Gath, and he is a sight that would make even the bravest heart tremble. Standing nearly 10 feet tall, Goliath is a giant among men. His frame is muscular and imposing, built like a fortress of flesh and bone. His bronze helmet catches the sunlight, and his scale armour gleams like the surface of a deep, dark sea. Each scale of his armour has been carefully crafted, overlapping like fish scales, to create an almost impenetrable defence. The armour alone weighs more than many men could carry, yet Goliath wears it as easily as another man might wear a simple tunic. In his massive hand he carries a spear whose iron point is as large as a weaver's rod, and whose shaft is thick as a small tree. On his back hangs a bronze sword, and his legs are protected by bronze greaves that shine like mirrors. Walking before him is his armour-bearer, a man who would be considered large in any other company, but appears almost childlike next to his champion. As Goliath reaches the centre of the valley, near the gently flowing brook, he stops and turns to face the Israelite camp on the eastern hill. Then, in a voice that booms across the valley like thunder, he issues his daily challenge. "Why do you come out and line up for battle?" His voice echoes off the hillsides, causing birds to take flight from the olive trees. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." He pauses, letting his words sink in, and then continues with a sneer that the Israelite soldiers can hear even from their distant positions. "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." The challenge hangs in the morning air like a dark cloud. On the hillside, King Saul's army shifts nervously. These are not cowards, these soldiers of Israel. They are men who have fought battles and defended their homeland with courage. But Goliath represents something beyond normal warfare. He is not just a man. He seems like a force of nature, an unstoppable mountain of bronze and flesh. Among the Israelite ranks are 3 brothers, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, sons of Jesse from Bethlehem. They stand with their fellow soldiers, feeling the same chill of fear that grips every man present. They've heard stories of giants in the land, descendants of the Anakim, who struck terror in the hearts of their forefathers. But seeing Goliath is different from hearing stories. His very presence seems to drain the courage from their hearts. King Saul himself, who stands head and shoulders above most men, feels small in comparison to this Philistine champion. The king who once stood fearlessly against Israel's enemies now finds himself at a loss. He has offered great rewards to any man who will face Goliath, riches beyond measure, his own daughter in marriage, and exemption from taxes for the victor's family. But for 39 days, no man has stepped forward. As Goliath's voice fades across the valley, an oppressive silence settles over both camps. The Philistines are confident, almost jovial in their certainty. Their champion is invincible, and they know it. Soon all of Israel will bow before their might. But in the Israelite camp, fear has taken root like a poisonous vine. With each passing day, with each repeated challenge, that fear grows stronger. The soldiers begin to whisper among themselves. Some wonder if they should retreat. Others question whether God has abandoned them. The shadow of one man, one giant, is darkening the faith of an entire nation. Yet God, who sees all things, who knows the end from the beginning, has already prepared an answer to this seemingly impossible challenge. And that answer is not a mighty warrior or a skilled general. It's a young shepherd boy who at this very moment is walking the dusty roads that lead to the valley of Elah, carrying nothing more threatening than food for his brothers and cheese for their commander. As the day progresses and Goliath returns to his camp with another unchallenged victory, the stage is being set for an encounter that will demonstrate, once and for all, that the battle belongs not to the strong, but to the Lord. The morning sun is climbing higher when David crests the hill overlooking the valley of Elah. He's been walking since before dawn, carrying a heavy pack filled with roasted grain and 10 loaves of fresh bread for his brothers and 10 cuts of cheese for their unit commander. His father Jesse, concerned about his son serving in King Saul's army, has sent David to check on them and bring them provisions. As David approaches the Israelite camp, he can hear the familiar sounds of an army preparing for battle. The clank of bronze armour, the scraping of swords being sharpened, and the low murmur of soldiers' voices. But there's something else in the air, something David can sense even before he understands it. There's a tension here, a fear that seems to hang over the camp like morning fog. David makes his way through the camp, asking for directions to find his brothers. The soldiers he passes look weary, their faces drawn with anxiety. Some pace nervously, others sit quietly, staring toward the valley. This is not what David expected to find. Where is the courage of Israel's army? Where is the confidence that should come from serving the God who delivered them from Egypt and gave them this promised land? Finally, David spots his brothers among their unit, and his face brightens with joy. He hurries toward them, his pack bouncing on his shoulders, but as he greets Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, he notices that they too carry the same haunted expression as the other soldiers. "Father sent provisions," David says warmly, beginning to unpack the food. "He's been worried about you and wanted to make sure you have enough to eat." But before his brothers can respond fully to his greeting, a sound begins to build from across the valley. It starts as a low rumble and grows into the unmistakable boom of Goliath's voice. David stops unpacking and turns toward the valley, his eyes widening as he sees the massive figure striding down the hillside. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David asks, his voice filled not with fear, but with indignation. The words come naturally to him, spoken with the simple faith of someone who knows God personally, intimately, like a shepherd knows his flock. The soldiers around David stare at him in amazement. Some even step back, as if his words might bring Goliath's wrath down upon them. But David isn't speaking recklessly. He's speaking from a heart that has experienced God's faithfulness. In the quiet places, in the fields where he tends sheep, under the stars where he plays his harp and sings psalms to the God who made them. What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? David continues, his voice carrying a confidence that seems foreign in this camp of frightened warriors. The soldiers explain about King Saul's promised rewards, but David barely seems to hear them. His focus is not on gold or marriage or tax exemption. His concern is for the honour of God and the reputation of God's people. How can this Philistine be allowed to mock the armies of the living God? How can Israel's soldiers allow this blasphemy to continue day after day? Word of David's questions and his bold words quickly spreads through the camp. Some soldiers are amazed by his courage. Others think he's simply too young to understand the danger. But when the news reaches Eliab, David's oldest brother, he responds with anger and embarrassment. "Why have you come down here?" Eliab demands, his face flushed with frustration. "And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are, and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." Eliab's harsh words reveal the tension that can exist even in families when faith and fear collide. Perhaps Eliab is embarrassed that his youngest brother shows more courage than he and his fellow soldiers have demonstrated. Perhaps he's genuinely concerned for David's safety. But David responds with gentle humility. "Now what have I done?" David asks calmly. "Can't I even speak?" He doesn't argue with his brother or defend himself harshly. Instead, he simply continues asking his questions, seeking to understand why no one has stepped forward to defend God's honour. Eventually, word of David's bold questions reaches King Saul himself. The king, desperate for any glimmer of hope, sends for this young man who speaks so fearlessly about facing the Philistine giant. When David is brought before him, Saul sees nothing impressive about this youth. David is small, young, with the sun-darkened skin of someone who works outdoors. He carries no sword, no armour, nothing that would mark him as a warrior. "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine," David says to the king with quiet confidence. "Your servant will go and fight him." King Saul looks at David in disbelief. "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him," he says, his voice heavy with the weight of responsibility and fear. "You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David's response comes from a wellspring of faith that has been tested and proven in the wilderness places where no one was watching. "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep," David begins, his voice steady and sure. "When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God." David pauses, and in that pause the tent seems to fill with the presence of something greater than human courage. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Here is the key to David's confidence. It's not based on his own strength or skill. It's not rooted in pride or youthful foolishness. David's courage comes from his personal experience of God's faithfulness. In the quiet places when no one was watching except God, David learned to trust. When wild beasts threatened his father's sheep, David didn't run. He stood and fought, not in his own strength, but trusting in the God who had called him to be a shepherd. King Saul, moved by David's faith, and perhaps remembering his own younger days when he trusted God more completely, finally gives his consent. "Go," he says, "and the Lord be with you." Wanting to give David every possible advantage, Saul dresses him in his own tunic and puts a bronze helmet on his head and a coat of armour on his body. He gives David his own sword to carry, but when David tries to walk in all this military gear, he finds he can hardly move. "I cannot go in these," David says to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he takes off the armour, removes the helmet, and sets aside the sword. He will not try to become something he's not, or fight in a way that's foreign to him. David will face Goliath as himself, a shepherd boy who trusts in the living God. Instead, David picks up his staff, the simple wooden rod that has been his companion through countless days in the fields. He goes to the brook that runs through the valley and carefully selects 5 smooth stones worn perfectly round by the flowing water. He places these in his shepherd's bag and takes his sling in his hand. As David walks toward the valley, he carries with him something more powerful than any bronze armour or iron sword. He carries the confidence that comes from knowing God personally, from experiencing his faithfulness in the quiet places of life. And he carries the understanding that this battle is not really between David and Goliath at all. This is a battle between the God of Israel and the false gods of the Philistines, between truth and blasphemy, between faith and fear. The young shepherd is ready to face the giant, not because he is strong, but because he knows the one who is stronger than any earthly power. The afternoon sun hangs bright and warm over the valley of Elah as 2 figures begin their approach toward each other across the grassy floor of the valley. The contrast between them could not be more dramatic, and yet it's precisely in this contrast that God's glory will be revealed. From the western hill, Goliath begins his descent, his bronze armour catching and reflecting the sunlight like a beacon. Each step he takes shakes the ground slightly, and the sound of his armour clanking echoes across the valley. He moves with the confidence of someone who has never known defeat, never felt the sting of uncertainty. His armour-bearer walks before him, carrying the massive shield that will protect the giant from any arrows that might be fired from the Israelite lines. From the eastern hill, David begins his own journey down into the valley. He walks with a steady, purposeful gait, his simple shepherd's clothing a stark contrast to the military spectacle approaching from the other side. In one hand he carries his staff, worn smooth by years of use. In the other, he holds his sling, a simple leather pouch attached to 2 cords, the kind of weapon that shepherds have used for generations to protect their flocks from predators. Behind David on the hillside, the entire Israelite army watches in stunned silence. Thousands of seasoned warriors stand motionless, their eyes fixed on the small figure walking steadily towards certain death. Some of them pray silently, asking God to protect this brave boy. Others shake their heads in disbelief at what they perceive as pointless sacrifice. King Saul watches from his position among his officers, his heart heavy with the responsibility for sending a youth to face a giant. On the opposite hill, the Philistine army watches with amusement and anticipation. They point at David and laugh among themselves, joking about how quickly their champion will dispatch this boy. Some of them are already making plans for the victory celebration they'll hold after Israel surrenders, as surely they must, after witnessing their champion's inevitable defeat. But as David walks down the hillside, his heart is neither fearful nor boastful. Instead, it's filled with a quiet confidence that comes from knowing he is not walking into this valley alone. The same God who helped him rescue sheep from the mouths of lions and bears is with him now. The same God who has been his shepherd will be his strength. As the 2 figures draw closer together in the centre of the valley, near the gently flowing brook, Goliath gets his first clear look at his opponent. What he sees fills him with contempt and rage. This is not a warrior, this is just a boy, ruddy and handsome, carrying a shepherd's simple tools instead of weapons of war. "Am I a dog," Goliath roars, his voice booming across the valley, "that you come at me with sticks?" His anger at what he perceives as an insult burns hot. He expected Israel to send their greatest warrior, someone worthy of his attention. Instead, they've sent a child. Goliath continues his verbal assault, his voice carrying clearly to both armies. "Come here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." The threat hangs in the air like the cry of a predator, and even some of the Philistine soldiers feel a chill at the cruelty in their champion's voice. But David, standing in the valley, with the afternoon sun behind him, casting his shadow long across the grass, remains unshaken. When he speaks, his voice carries clearly across the valley, and every word is heard by both armies. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin," David calls out, his young voice strong and clear, "but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." The words echo across the valley like a bell ringing, clear and pure and full of power. David continues, and as he speaks, something changes in the atmosphere of the valley. The mocking laughter from the Philistine hill begins to fade. On the Israelite side, soldiers lean forward, straining to hear every word. "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." David's words ring with prophetic power and absolute certainty. He's not boasting in his own strength or skill. Instead, he's making a declaration of faith, a public testimony to the power and faithfulness of the God of Israel. This battle, David understands, is not ultimately about military might or human courage. It's about the honour of God and the revelation of his power to both Israel and the surrounding nations. Goliath, enraged by what he sees as blasphemous arrogance from a mere boy, begins moving quickly toward David, his massive frame covering the ground with surprising speed. His armour clanks and his weapons gleam as he bears down on his small opponent like an avalanche of bronze and iron. But David doesn't flee. Instead, he runs toward Goliath, closing the distance between them with swift, determined steps. As he runs, he reaches into his shepherd's bag and takes out one of the smooth stones he selected from the brook. With practiced ease, born of countless hours protecting sheep, he places the stone in his sling. The sling is not a child's toy, though it may appear simple. In the hands of a skilled shepherd, it's a precision weapon capable of tremendous force. David has used his sling to drive off wolves and bears, to guide wandering sheep, and to strike targets with accuracy at considerable distances. Now as he runs toward Goliath, all those years of practice culminate in this single, crucial moment. With fluid motion, perfected through countless repetitions, David begins to swing the sling around his head, building momentum. The leather pouch whispers through the air as it spins, faster and faster. Goliath, seeing David's movement, may have raised his shield or adjusted his position, but his great size, which has always been his advantage, now works against him. He cannot change direction quickly, cannot dodge with the agility of a smaller man. At the perfect moment, when the geometry of angle and distance and momentum align exactly right, David releases one of the cords. The stone flies from the sling like an arrow, swift and straight and true, guided by skill and powered by faith. The stone strikes Goliath in the centre of his forehead, at the one spot where his bronze helmet doesn't protect him, with tremendous force. The sound of impact echoes across the valley like the crack of thunder. For a moment time seems suspended. The giant warrior, seemingly invincible in his bronze armour, stands motionless. Then, like a great tree falling in the forest, Goliath topples forward and crashes to the ground. The earth trembles under the impact of his massive frame. His weapons clatter beside him, his armour scrapes against the stones, and then there is silence. David runs to where Goliath lies and stands over the fallen giant. Finding no sword of his own, David draws Goliath's own massive sword from its sheath, and with effort befitting his size, uses it to cut off the giant's head, fulfilling his prophecy exactly as he had spoken it. Then David lifts Goliath's head high above his own, and his voice rings out across the valley, one more time, "The battle is the Lord's." The silence that follows is profound and complete, broken only by the gentle sound of the brook flowing peacefully through the valley, washing the smooth stones that remain in David's shepherd's bag. The sight of their fallen champion creates an immediate and dramatic transformation in both armies. On the Philistine hillside, the confident laughter and casual conversation die away instantly, replaced by stunned silence and then growing panic. These seasoned warriors, who moments before were planning their victory celebration, now stare in disbelief at the impossible scene in the valley below. Their champion, their giant, their seemingly invincible Goliath lies motionless in the grass, his own sword in the hands of the shepherd boy, who stands triumphant beside his massive form. The psychological impact is devastating. If Goliath could fall to this young Israelite, what protection did they have? What power could stand against the God of Israel? On the eastern hillside, the transformation is equally dramatic, but runs in the opposite direction. The Israelite soldiers, who have been paralysed by fear for 40 days, suddenly find their voices in a great roar of triumph that echoes off the surrounding hills. The sound builds and builds, a crescendo of relief and joy and renewed confidence that seems to shake the very foundations of the valley. "The Lord has given us victories," they cry. "God has delivered the Philistines into our hands." Swords are drawn from sheaths, not in fear this time, but in confidence. Spears are raised high, and the entire army begins to surge down the hillside like a mighty river breaking through a dam. King Saul, watching from his position among his officers, feels his own heart lift with amazement and gratitude. The burden of fear that has pressed down on him for weeks suddenly lifts, replaced by the returning memory of what it means to serve the living God. He gives the command that his army is already anticipating. Charge! The Philistine army, seeing the Israelites rushing toward them and having lost their champion and their confidence in a single moment, turns and flees. What had been an organised military force becomes a scattered mob running for their lives across the hills and valleys of the countryside. The rout is complete and devastating. But as the armies chase and flee across the landscape, David remains in the valley beside the brook, holding Goliath's head and looking up toward heaven with a heart full of gratitude. He has not forgotten, even in this moment of triumph, that the victory belongs to the Lord. This was never about David's skill with a sling. Though his years of practice were important, this was never about David's courage. Though his faith was essential, this was about God's power to save his people and his determination to show both Israel and the nations around them that he alone is God. David understands something that many of the celebrating soldiers rushing past him have not yet grasped. This victory in the valley of Elah is not an end in itself, but a beginning. It's a demonstration of what becomes possible when someone is willing to trust completely in God's power and step forward in faith, even when the circumstances seem impossible. As David picks up his simple staff and adjusts his shepherd's bag, still containing 4 unused stones, he reflects on the events of the day. This morning he was simply bringing food to his brothers. Now he has become the deliverer of Israel, the slayer of giants, the one through whom God chose to demonstrate his power to the nations. But David's heart remains humble. He knows that he was simply the instrument God chose to use. The smooth stones came from God's creation. The skill to use the sling came from God's provision of years in the wilderness. The courage to step forward came from God's faithfulness in past trials. Even the opportunity to be in the valley today came from God's sovereign orchestration of events. As the sun begins to set over the valley of Elah, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, David begins the journey back up the hillside. Behind him, the brook continues to flow peacefully, its waters singing the same gentle song they sang this morning, as if nothing extraordinary had happened here at all. But everything has changed. Israel has been delivered from their enemies. The name of the Lord has been glorified before the nations. Fear has been replaced with faith, and despair has given way to hope. Most importantly, everyone who witnessed this day now knows with certainty that there is a God in Israel, and that the battle belongs to the Lord. The young shepherd boy who walked down into the valley, carrying only his simple faith and his trust in God, walks back up the hillside as a champion. But he carries with him the same faith and the same trust, because he understands that these were the real weapons that won the victory. Size and strength and bronze armour are nothing compared to the power of the living God when it flows through a heart that trusts him completely. As David rejoins the celebrating Israelite army, his brothers look at him with new eyes. Eliab, who scolded him harshly this morning, now embraces him with tears of joy and amazement. The soldiers who barely noticed the young shepherd this morning now gather around him with respect and wonder, eager to hear him tell the story of his victory. But David's first words are not about his own actions or his own courage. Instead, he lifts his eyes toward heaven and says simply, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who has delivered his people this day." The victory belongs to the Lord, and David never forgets it. This understanding, this heart of worship and gratitude, even in the moment of triumph, is what will carry David through all the challenges that lie ahead in his remarkable life. For this is not the end of David's story, but the beginning. This day in the valley of Elah reveals the heart of a shepherd who will one day be king, a man after God's own heart, who will lead Israel with the same faith and trust he showed when facing a giant with nothing but a sling and the name of the Lord. As we reflect on this timeless story of David and Goliath, we discover that it offers us profound truths that speak directly to our own lives and challenges. The Valley of Elah becomes a classroom where God teaches us about faith, courage, preparation, and the source of true victory. Let's explore these lessons together, allowing them to settle into our hearts like seeds planted in good soil. One of the most striking aspects of David's story is how thoroughly unlikely he seems as a champion. When the prophet Samuel came to Jesse's house to anoint the next king of Israel, Jesse didn't even bother to call David in from the fields at first. David was the youngest, the smallest, the one everyone overlooked. Even his own brothers saw him as insignificant, more of an annoyance than a hero. Yet God specifically chose this overlooked shepherd boy to accomplish what none of Israel's mighty warriors dared attempt. This pattern runs throughout Scripture and continues in our world today. God delights in using people the world considers insignificant to accomplish his greatest purposes. He chooses the weak to shame the strong, the foolish to confound the wise, the humble to teach the proud. This truth offers tremendous encouragement to anyone who has ever felt overlooked, undervalued, or insignificant. Perhaps you feel too young, too old, too inexperienced, or too ordinary to make a difference. Perhaps others have dismissed your dreams or minimized your contributions. If so, you're in excellent company. Moses felt too inadequate to speak for God. Gideon felt too weak to lead an army. Esther felt too powerless to influence a king. Mary felt too young to bear the Messiah. But God sees what others miss. He looks at the heart while others focus on outward appearances. He values faithfulness over fame, character over credentials, availability over ability. When you feel small in the eyes of the world, remember that you serve a God who specializes in doing extraordinary things through ordinary people who trust him completely. The key is not to become someone else, but to offer who you already are to God with complete surrender. David didn't try to become a traditional warrior. He remained a shepherd who trusted God. Your background, your personality, your unique experiences and perspective are not accidents. They are part of God's preparation for the work he has planned for you. David's courage in facing Goliath didn't appear suddenly on the day of battle. It was forged over years of faithful service in places where no one was watching except God. While tending his father's sheep in the wilderness, David faced lions and bears that threatened the flock. In those lonely, dangerous moments, with no audience to impress and no recognition to gain, David learned to depend completely on God's strength. These wilderness experiences became David's training ground. Each time he trusted God to help him protect the sheep, his faith grew stronger. Each time he saw God's faithfulness in the small things, his confidence in God's power increased. By the time he faced Goliath, David had a history with God, a track record of divine assistance that gave him unshakable confidence. This principle applies directly to our lives. The character we develop in private, the faithfulness we demonstrate when no one is watching, the trust we build through small challenges prepare us for the larger battles we'll face later. God often prepares us through what seem like insignificant experiences, developing in us the spiritual muscles we'll need for greater tasks. Perhaps you're in a season of quiet preparation right now. Maybe you're in a job that feels unimportant, dealing with challenges that seem mundane, or serving in ways that go unnoticed. Don't despise these experiences. See them as God's training ground, places where you can learn to trust Him completely without the pressure of public attention. Every act of faithfulness in small things builds spiritual strength. Every time you choose to trust God rather than worry, you're developing the faith muscles you'll need for larger challenges. Every moment you spend in prayer, study and worship during the ordinary days creates the spiritual foundation that will hold firm when storms come. David's Psalms reflect a man who knew God intimately through countless hours of communion in the wilderness. His worship wasn't reserved for public occasions. It was the natural overflow of a heart that had learned to recognize God's presence in solitary places. This private relationship with God became the source of his public courage. The contrast between David's response to Goliath and that of Israel's army reveals the transformative power of proper perspective. The Israelite soldiers saw Goliath's size and focused on their own inadequacy. They measured themselves against the giant and found themselves wanting. Fear paralyzed them because they were looking at the problem instead of at God. David saw the same giant but responded completely differently. Instead of focusing on Goliath's size, David focused on God's greatness. Instead of measuring himself against the Philistine champion, he remembered God's faithfulness in past challenges. Most importantly, David saw this confrontation not as David versus Goliath, but as the God of Israel versus the false gods of the Philistines. This shift in perspective made all the difference. When we focus on our problems, they appear insurmountable. When we focus on God, our problems find their proper proportion. The same challenge that paralyzes us with fear can become an opportunity to witness God's power when we view it through the lens of faith. Your Goliath may not be a 9-foot giant in bronze armour, but it's probably just as real and just as intimidating. It might be a health diagnosis that fills you with dread, a financial crisis that keeps you awake at night, a broken relationship that seems beyond repair, or a dream that feels impossible to achieve. Whatever giant you're facing, the same God who empowered David is available to you today. The key is learning to see your challenges through God's eyes rather than your own. When you focus on how big your problems are, they grow larger in your mind, and your faith shrinks. But when you focus on how big your God is, your problems find their proper place, and your faith grows stronger. Faith doesn't mean pretending problems don't exist or minimizing real challenges. David didn't pretend Goliath was small. He acknowledged the giant's formidable appearance and weapons. But faith means recognizing that God is greater than any challenge we face, and that His power is available to those who trust Him completely. Perhaps the most important lesson from David's story is his understanding that victory belongs to God alone. David never claimed credit for defeating Goliath. He never boasted about his skill with a sling or his courage in facing the giant. Instead, he consistently pointed to God as the source of his victory. This humility wasn't false modesty, it was accurate theology. David understood that without God's strength, he would have been just another casualty in the valley. With God's power, he became an instrument of divine deliverance. The difference was not in David himself, but in David's relationship with God and his willingness to trust completely in divine strength. This principle protects us from both despair and pride. When we face challenges that seem impossible, we can take courage from knowing that we don't have to rely on our own strength. The same God who empowered David is available to empower us. When we experience victory and success, we can maintain humility by remembering that every good gift comes from above. Recognizing that victory belongs to the Lord also frees us from the crushing pressure of trying to achieve success through our own efforts alone. We can work diligently, prepare thoroughly, and act courageously, but we do so knowing that ultimate success depends on God's blessing and power. This perspective brings both peace in the struggle and gratitude in the victory. As we conclude our time together in the valley of Elah, I want you to imagine yourself standing where David stood. The sun is setting behind you, casting long shadows across the grass. In front of you lies whatever giant has been challenging your faith, threatening your peace, or blocking your path forward. Your Goliath might be fear itself, that persistent anxiety that whispers lies about your future and your security. It might be doubt that questions God's goodness when life becomes difficult. Perhaps it's a pattern of sin that seems too strong to break, a relationship that appears too damaged to heal, or a dream that feels too big to pursue. Maybe your giant is loneliness that echoes in empty rooms and quiet evenings, or it could be anger that burns hot and destroys relationships. Perhaps it's despair that covers your days like a dark cloud, making it hard to see hope or purpose. Whatever giant you're facing, remember David's words, "I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty." You don't have to face your challenges alone. You don't have to rely solely on your own strength, wisdom, or resources. The same God who empowered a shepherd boy to defeat a giant warrior is present with you today. Like David, you may feel small and inadequate when you look at the size of your challenges. That's normal and even healthy, because it drives you to depend on God rather than yourself. But don't let the size of your problems overshadow the greatness of your God. Don't let the voice of your giant drown out the whisper of divine love that calls you forward in faith. Remember that God has been preparing you for this moment through all the quiet experiences of your life. Every time you've chosen trust over worry, every moment you've experienced God's faithfulness in small things, every prayer you've whispered in the darkness has been building the spiritual strength you need for this challenge. Take up your simple faith like David took up his sling. Select the smooth stones of God's promises that have been worn smooth by the flowing waters of his love. Step forward, not in your own strength, but in the name of the Lord who loves you completely and fights on your behalf. And remember, the battle belongs to the Lord. Your job is not to guarantee the outcome, but to trust the one who holds the outcome in his hands. Your calling is not to be strong enough to win, but to be faithful enough to step forward when God calls. As you face your giants, may you have David's courage to step forward, his faith to trust completely, and his wisdom to give God all the glory for whatever victories he grants. May you discover, as David did, that with God all things are possible, and that no giant is too large for the power of divine love. Let us pray together. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the story of David and Goliath, which reminds us that you delight in using ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. Help us to see our challenges through your eyes rather than our own fears. Give us David's courage to step forward when you call, his faith to trust in your power rather than our own strength, and his humility to give you glory for every victory. We place our giants before you today, Lord, whatever form they may take in our lives. We acknowledge that we cannot defeat them in our own strength, but we trust in your power to deliver us. Use our weaknesses to display your strength, our fears to showcase your faithfulness, and our victories to bring glory to your name. Help us to be faithful in the quiet places of preparation, knowing that you are building in us the character and faith we'll need for the challenges ahead. May we never forget that the battle belongs to you, and may we always be quick to give you praise for your goodness and mercy in our lives. In the name of Jesus, our Good Shepherd and mighty champion, we pray. Amen. Sleep well, dear friends, knowing that the same God who was with David in the valley is with you wherever your journey leads. May his peace guard your hearts and minds, and may you wake tomorrow with renewed faith to face whatever giants await. Until we meet again in another story, may God's love surround you like a shepherd's care, and may his strength be your portion in every season. Thank you for joining us at Sacred Slumber, where every story reminds us that we are deeply loved and never alone.
Hello dear friends, and welcome back to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I hope your day has been filled with blessings and peace. Whether it's morning where you are, the quiet of afternoon, or the gentle embrace of evening, know that you are exactly where God wants you to be in this moment. I'm curious about where in this beautiful world you're listening from tonight. Are you nestled in your bed in a bustling city, or perhaps finding solace in the countryside under a canopy of stars? Wherever you are, whatever time it is for you, you are welcomed here with open arms. If this story touches your heart tonight, I encourage you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber. We gather here regularly to explore the profound truths and timeless wisdom found in God's Word, bringing comfort to weary souls and strength to troubled hearts. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these sacred stories that remind us of God's unfailing love and faithfulness. Now let us journey together to ancient Israel, to a time when kingdoms stood at crossroads, when truth was a dangerous commodity, and when one man's courage would echo through the ages. This is the story of Micaiah, the forgotten prophet who dared to stand alone. The sun blazed mercilessly over the ancient city of Samaria, its golden rays dancing across the limestone walls of King Ahab's palace. Within those walls, power brooked no opposition, and truth was often the first casualty of political ambition. It had been 3 years since the last war between Israel and Syria, 3 years of uneasy peace that sat heavy on King Ahab's shoulders like an ill-fitting crown. Ahab paced the marble floors of his throne room, his royal robes rustling with each agitated step. The king of Israel was a man consumed by his desires, a ruler who had long ago traded his soul to the altar of self-interest. His marriage to the foreign princess Jezebel had brought prosperity to his kingdom, but at a cost that would echo through generations. The worship of Baal had infiltrated the very heart of Israel, and the prophets of the Lord had been hunted, killed, or driven into hiding. Yet today something stirred within Ahab's ambitious heart. News had arrived that morning of Syrian movements near Ramoth-Gilead, a strategic city that had once belonged to Israel, but now languished under enemy control. The city's location made it a prize worth fighting for, a gateway that could secure trade routes and strengthen his kingdom's eastern border. As Ahab contemplated this opportunity, word came that King Jehoshaphat of Judah was approaching Samaria with a considerable entourage. Jehoshaphat was everything Ahab was not. A king who sought the Lord's face, who had torn down the high places of idol worship, and who ruled with righteousness as his compass. The irony was not lost on Ahab that he would need the help of such a man to achieve his ambitions. The great doors of the throne room swung open with a resonant boom, and Jehoshaphat entered with the dignity befitting a king of David's lineage. He was a man of medium stature but commanding presence, his beard meticulously groomed, and his eyes holding the wisdom of one who had walked closely with the Almighty. Behind him came his advisors and military commanders, their expressions respectful but cautious, as they entered the domain of Israel's controversial king. "Jehoshaphat, my brother," Ahab called out, his voice echoing through the vast chamber as he descended from his throne. "Welcome to Samaria. Your presence brings honour to my house." The two kings embraced in the customary greeting, though those who knew them well could sense the underlying tension. Jehoshaphat had come seeking alliance, but his heart was troubled by what such an alliance might require of him. "Ahab," Jehoshaphat replied warmly, though his eyes remained watchful. "It has been too long since we have spoken face to face. The Lord has blessed both our kingdoms with peace these past years." "Indeed," Ahab agreed, gesturing toward the laden tables his servants had prepared. "Come, let us feast together and speak of matters that concern us both." The banquet that followed was a spectacle of royal excess. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and wine from the finest vineyards. Musicians played softly in the background, while servants moved like shadows, attending to every need. Yet beneath the veneer of celebration, both kings harboured their own purposes. As the evening wore on and the wine loosened tongues, Ahab finally revealed his true intention. Leaning toward Jehoshaphat with the conspiratorial air of old friends, he spoke in measured tones. "My brother, there is a matter that weighs heavily upon my heart," Ahab began, his eyes glinting in the torchlight. "You know that Ramoth-Gilead belongs to us, yet it remains in the hands of the king of Syria. Should we not take back what is rightfully ours?" Jehoshaphat set down his goblet carefully, his expression growing thoughtful. He had anticipated this moment, knowing that Ahab rarely extended hospitality without purpose. The question hung in the air between them like incense, heavy with implication. "Ramoth-Gilead has indeed been a source of contention," Jehoshaphat replied diplomatically. "What do you propose?" Ahab's smile was that of a merchant who senses a favourable negotiation. "I propose that we go up together against Ramoth-Gilead. Your army combined with mine would be formidable. We could restore the city to Israel and share in the glory of victory." The words were carefully chosen, appealing to both practical strategy and Jehoshaphat's sense of brotherhood among the tribes of Israel. Yet Jehoshaphat had not survived as king by making hasty decisions. His reign had been marked by careful consultation with the Lord, and he would not abandon that practice now. "I am as you are," Jehoshaphat responded slowly. "My people as your people, my horses as your horses. If the Lord wills it, we shall stand together in battle." He paused, his next words carrying the weight of true conviction. "But first let us inquire of the Lord." Ahab's smile faltered slightly. In his eagerness for military glory, he had hoped to avoid the complications that divine consultation might bring. Yet he could hardly refuse such a reasonable request from a potential ally, especially one whose righteousness was renowned throughout the region. "Of course," Ahab agreed, though his tone lacked enthusiasm. "Let us seek the word of the Lord." What followed was a demonstration of the spiritual corruption that had infected Ahab's court. The king summoned his prophets, all 400 of them, men who wore the garments of holiness, but whose hearts served earthly masters. They came in a great procession, their robes flowing and their voices raised in what appeared to be spiritual fervour. These were not true prophets of the Lord, though they claimed his name. They were court prophets, men who understood that their continued prosperity depended upon telling the king what he wished to hear. Their prophecies were crafted not in the secret place of prayer, but in the calculating chambers of political expediency. As the prophets assembled in the courtyard before the two kings, their spokesman stepped forward. His name was Zedekiah, son of Chenaanah, a man whose pride matched his ambition, and whose hatred for true prophets would soon be revealed in violent fashion. "Hear the word of the Lord," Zedekiah proclaimed, his voice carrying across the courtyard with theatrical intensity. "Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and prosper, for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." The 400 prophets took up the cry with orchestrated precision, their voices creating a chorus of false assurance. Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and prosper. The Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king. Some of the prophets had even prepared visual aids for their performance. They danced and shouted, waving swords and spears, creating a spectacle that would have been impressive to any observer unfamiliar with the ways of true prophecy. The din was tremendous, the enthusiasm seemingly genuine, and the message exactly what Ahab longed to hear. Yet as Jehoshaphat watched this display, his spirit grew troubled. Something about the performance felt hollow, manufactured. These men spoke with one voice, but it was not the voice of the Lord that Jehoshaphat knew from his own times of prayer and seeking. There was no cost to their prophecy, no challenge to the king's desires, no hint of the divine complexity that marked true encounters with the Almighty. As the prophets continued their enthusiastic proclamations, Jehoshaphat raised his hand for silence. The courtyard gradually quieted, though the echo of their shouts seemed to linger in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Is there not here a prophet of the Lord besides these, Jehoshaphat asked carefully, that we might inquire of him? The question fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of discomfort through the assembly. Ahab's face darkened, and several of the court prophets exchanged meaningful glances. They all knew there was indeed another prophet, one whose very existence was a thorn in the flesh of everyone present. Ahab's response came through gritted teeth, his voice barely concealing his irritation. There is still one man, Micaiah the son of Imlah, by whom we may inquire of the Lord, but I hate him, for he does not prophesy good concerning me, but evil. The honesty of Ahab's admission was startling in its nakedness. Here was a king openly declaring his hatred for a prophet based not on any moral failing or false prophecy, but simply because the man refused to tell him what he wanted to hear. It was a moment that revealed the true spiritual state of Israel's leadership. Jehoshaphat, ever the diplomat, sought to smooth over the awkward moment. "Let not the king say such things," he replied gently, though his words carried a subtle rebuke. Ahab realized he had revealed too much of his heart. With visible effort he composed himself and called for one of his officers. "Bring Micaiah the son of Imlah quickly," he commanded, though his tone suggested he would rather summon a plague upon his house. As the officer hurried away on his grim errand, the two kings settled in to wait. The 400 prophets remained in the courtyard, their earlier enthusiasm now tempered by the knowledge that their unanimous voice was about to be challenged by a single man they both feared and despised. The sun continued its relentless journey across the sky, and in the distance the sound of the officer's horse could be heard galloping toward the place where truth dwelt in isolation, where a forgotten prophet waited in the shadows of his integrity. The horse's hooves struck the dusty road with rhythmic precision as the king's officer rode toward the humble dwelling where Micaiah made his home. The prophet lived simply, far from the luxury of the royal court, in a stone house that spoke of function rather than ostentation. Here, away from the corrupting influence of political power, dwelt a man who had chosen faithfulness over favour, truth over comfort. Micaiah son of Imlah was not an imposing figure by earthly standards. Of average height and lean build, he bore the weathered appearance of one who had walked through many storms. His beard was streaked with silver, and his eyes held the deep weariness of a man who had spoken unpopular truths for too many years. Yet there was something unbreakable in his demeanour, a quality that suggested he had found his anchor in something far stronger than human approval. When the king's messenger arrived, Micaiah was in his garden, tending to the vegetables that provided much of his sustenance. The prophet lived modestly, supported by the occasional gifts of those few souls who still valued truth above comfort. He had long ago learned to find contentment in simple things, the satisfaction of honest work, the peace of prayer, and the quiet joy of communion with the Almighty. "Micaiah," the officer called out as he dismounted, "the king commands your presence immediately." The prophet looked up from his work, unsurprised. He had sensed in recent days that the Lord was preparing him for something significant. His prayers had been marked by an unusual intensity, and his dreams had been filled with visions he did not yet fully understand. "Very well," Micaiah replied simply, setting aside his tools. "Let me wash and prepare myself." As Micaiah went about the task of making himself presentable for the royal court, the officer felt compelled to share information that might save the prophet from making a costly mistake. The man had witnessed what happened to those who crossed King Ahab, and despite his loyalty to the crown, he possessed enough humanity to feel concern for this solitary figure. "Listen to me, Micaiah," the officer said, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "The words of the prophets declare good to the king with one mouth. Let your word be like the word of one of them, and speak favourably." It was well-intentioned advice, offered by a man who understood the political realities of Ahab's court. The officer had seen the 400 prophets deliver their unanimous message of victory and prosperity. He knew that Micaiah's reputation for speaking uncomfortable truths could lead to imprisonment, exile, or worse. In his mind, he was offering the prophet a lifeline, a chance to align himself with the majority and avoid the consequences of standing alone. Micaiah paused in his preparations, considering the messenger's words. The offer was clear: conform, agree with the crowd, tell the king what he wants to hear, and enjoy the benefits of royal favour. It would be so easy, so practical, so utterly reasonable by every human measure. But as Micaiah looked into the officer's earnest face, he felt the familiar stirring of the spirit within him, that unmistakable presence that had guided him through decades of faithful service. The Lord had not called him to an easy path, but he had never failed to provide strength for the journey. "As the Lord lives," Micaiah replied with quiet dignity, "whatever the Lord says to me, that I will speak." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration of absolute commitment that left no room for compromise. The officer's face showed his disappointment and concern, but he knew better than to argue further. He had delivered his warning. What the prophet did with it was beyond his control. The journey back to Samaria was made in relative silence, the officer pondering the stubborn integrity of his passenger, while Micaiah prayed and prepared his heart for whatever lay ahead. As they approached the city, the prophet could see the banners of both Israel and Judah flying from the palace walls, confirming his suspicion that this summons involved more than a routine consultation. The palace courtyard was a scene of controlled chaos when they arrived. Servants scurried about preparing for what appeared to be an important gathering, while guards stood at attention in their finest armour. The 400 prophets were still present, clustered in small groups and speaking in hushed tones. Their earlier enthusiasm had given way to a more subdued attitude, though their confidence in their message remained unshaken. As Micaiah dismounted and followed the officer toward the throne room, he could feel the weight of many eyes upon him. Some looks were curious, others hostile, and a few held the barely concealed contempt of those who viewed his independence as a personal affront. He had grown accustomed to such reactions over the years, understanding that his very presence served as an uncomfortable reminder of the spiritual compromise that permeated the court. The great doors opened before them, revealing the opulent throne room where Kings Ahab and Jehoshaphat waited. The contrast between the two rulers was immediately apparent even to a casual observer. Ahab sat upon his throne with the restless energy of a man driven by ambition, his fingers drumming impatiently on the armrest. Jehoshaphat, seated in a chair of equal honour nearby, maintained the composed dignity of one accustomed to seeking divine guidance before making important decisions. "Ah, Micaiah," Ahab said as the prophet entered, his tone carrying forced joviality that fooled no one. "At last, our final consultant arrives." Micaiah approached the throne with measured steps, neither hurrying to show deference nor dawdling to display defiance. He had learned long ago that in the presence of earthly power, his allegiance belonged to a higher authority. When he reached the appropriate distance, he bowed respectfully but not obsequiously, acknowledging the king's position without compromising his own integrity. "You summoned me, your majesty," Micaiah said simply, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. King Jehoshaphat studied the prophet with interest. He had heard reports of Micaiah's reputation for uncompromising honesty, and after witnessing the theatrical performance of the 400 prophets, he was eager to hear from someone who might offer a different perspective. Ahab leaned forward on his throne, his eyes fixed on the solitary figure before him. "Micaiah, shall we go to war against Ramoth-Gilead, or shall we refrain?" It was the same question that had been posed to the 400 prophets, the same inquiry that had produced such enthusiastic unanimity. Now it fell upon the shoulders of one man who stood alone, without allies or supporters, facing the combined expectation of two kings and their assembled courts. The moment stretched taut with anticipation. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something significant, though few could have predicted the drama that was about to unfold. In the silence, Micaiah felt the familiar stirring of the spirit, but what came first was not the word of the Lord, but something altogether unexpected. What happened next would be remembered and debated for generations to come. Micaiah, the prophet known for his uncompromising honesty, looked directly at King Ahab and delivered exactly the message the king wanted to hear. "Go up and prosper," Micaiah declared, his voice carrying throughout the throne room, "for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled court. The 400 prophets exchanged glances of confusion and perhaps a touch of irritation. Here was the man they had feared would contradict their unanimous verdict, and instead he was confirming their prophecy word for word. Some of them smiled with what they imagined was vindication, while others seemed puzzled by this unexpected development. But King Ahab was no fool. Despite his many moral failings, he had known Micaiah for years, had heard his prophecies of judgment and warning countless times. Never once had the prophet told him what he wanted to hear. Never once had Micaiah's words aligned so perfectly with royal desires. The king's eyes narrowed as he studied the prophet's face, searching for the truth behind this suspicious compliance. There was something in Micaiah's tone, a subtle quality that suggested layers beneath the surface of his words. It was the same tone a parent might use when agreeing with a child's obviously foolish plan, allowing them to proceed while knowing full well what the consequences would be. King Jehoshaphat, too, sensed that something was amiss, though he remained silent, observing the interaction with keen interest. "How many times shall I make you swear," Ahab said slowly, his voice carrying a warning, "that you tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord?" It was a remarkable moment. Here was a king who had just received exactly the prophecy he desired, yet his own conscience convicted him that it could not be genuine. Ahab understood Micaiah well enough to know that such easy agreement was completely out of character. In demanding the truth, the king was inadvertently acknowledging that he recognized the difference between authentic prophecy and the comfortable lies he typically preferred. Micaiah stood silent for a moment, and those watching could see a visible change come over him. The sardonic expression faded from his face, replaced by the solemn countenance of one who was about to deliver a message from the throne room of heaven. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality altogether, the unmistakable authority of divine revelation. "I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep that have no shepherd," Micaiah began, his words falling like stones into the sudden silence. "And the Lord said, 'These have no master. Let each return to his house in peace.'" The impact of these words was immediate and devastating. The vision was clear to everyone present. Israel would be defeated, their army scattered, and their king would not return from battle. It was a prophecy of military disaster and royal death, delivered with the calm certainty of one who had seen beyond the veil of earthly circumstances. King Ahab's face flushed with anger, but beneath the rage was something that looked remarkably like fear. He turned to Jehoshaphat with the bitter satisfaction of one whose worst expectations have been confirmed. "Did I not tell you," Ahab said, his voice heavy with frustration, "that he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil?" But Micaiah was not finished. The Spirit of the Lord had opened his eyes to see into the very council chambers of heaven, and what he had witnessed there needed to be shared, regardless of the consequences. The prophet's voice took on an even more solemn tone as he continued. "Therefore hear the word of the Lord," Micaiah declared, his words cutting through the tension in the room like a sword. "I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by, on his right hand and on his left." The court fell absolutely silent, Even the most worldly and cynical among them recognized that they were hearing something extraordinary. This was not the political manoeuvring they were accustomed to, nor the comfortable reassurances of the court prophets. This was a glimpse into eternal realities, a revelation of divine purpose that transcended human understanding. And the Lord said, Micaiah continued, "Who will persuade Ahab to go up, that he may fall at Ramoth-Gilead?" So one spoke in this manner, and another spoke in that manner. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, "I will persuade him." The Lord said to him, "In what way?" And he said, "I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets." And the Lord said, "You shall persuade him and also prevail. Go out and do so." The revelation was staggering in its implications. Micaiah was claiming that the Lord himself had allowed, indeed, had orchestrated, the deception that had been proclaimed by the 400 prophets. It was a divine judgment in the form of false prophecy, a spiritual trap set for a king who had repeatedly chosen lies over truth. Therefore, Micaiah concluded with inexorable logic, "Look, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these prophets of yours, and the Lord has declared disaster concerning you." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person present was forced to grapple with the implications of what they had heard. The 400 prophets found themselves accused not merely of error, but of being unwitting instruments of divine deception. The kings faced the terrifying possibility that their carefully planned military campaign was actually a trap set by the Almighty himself. But the silence was short-lived. Zedekiah, the spokesman for the 400 prophets, was a man of considerable pride and ambition. He had built his reputation on his supposed connection to the divine, and Micaiah's words threatened not only his credibility but his entire worldview. The accusation that he had been deceived by a lying spirit was more than he could bear. With a roar of rage, Zedekiah strode across the throne room until he stood face to face with Micaiah. The contrast between them was striking. Zedekiah in his fine robes and carefully groomed appearance, representing the comfortable religiosity of the court, facing Micaiah in his simple garments, embodying the uncompromising voice of authentic prophecy. "Which way did the Spirit from the Lord go from me to speak to you?" Zedekiah demanded, his voice shaking with fury. It was a desperate attempt to challenge Micaiah's authority, to suggest that if anyone possessed a connection to the divine, it was surely the spokesman for 400 prophets rather than this isolated troublemaker. But before Micaiah could respond, Zedekiah's anger overwhelmed his judgment entirely. The sound of the slap echoed through the throne room like a thunderclap. Zedekiah had struck Micaiah across the face with sufficient force to stagger the prophet, leaving a red mark on his cheek that would serve as a visible reminder of what it cost to speak truth in the face of comfortable lies. The act of violence hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. No one moved or spoke, shocked by the sudden transition from theological debate to physical assault. Micaiah slowly straightened, touching his cheek where Zedekiah's hand had left its mark. When he looked up, there was no anger in his eyes, no desire for retaliation. Instead, there was a sadness that seemed to encompass not only his immediate situation, but the entire spiritual state of the nation. "Indeed," Micaiah said quietly, his voice carrying despite its gentle tone, "you shall see on that day when you go into an inner chamber to hide." It was both prophecy and promise. The day would come when Zedekiah's false confidence would crumble, when the reality of divine judgment would force him to seek shelter from the consequences of his deception. The words carried the weight of inevitable fulfillment, spoken not in anger, but with the sorrowful certainty of one who had seen the future and found it tragic. King Ahab had heard enough. The prophet's words had struck too close to uncomfortable truths, had challenged too directly the comfortable illusions upon which he had built his reign. The vision of divine deception, the prophecy of military disaster, the humiliating suggestion that his 400 prophets were unwitting instruments of judgment, all of it combined to create a rage that demanded immediate action. "Take Micaiah," the king commanded, his voice sharp with fury, "and return him to Amon, the governor of the city, and to Joash the king's son, and say, 'Thus says the king, put this fellow in prison, and feed him with bread of affliction and water of affliction until I come in peace.'" The order was both punishment and insurance policy. By imprisoning Micaiah until his safe return from battle, Ahab was attempting to nullify the prophecy through royal decree. It was a desperate act of defiance against divine judgment, a futile attempt to bind the word of the Lord with chains and prison walls. But Micaiah was not finished. Even as the guards moved toward him, even as the shadow of imprisonment fell across his path, the prophet had one final word to speak. His voice rang out across the throne room with the clarity of absolute conviction. "If you ever return in peace, the Lord has not spoken by me." The words were a direct challenge to royal authority, a public declaration that put Micaiah's credibility as a prophet on the line. He was essentially saying that if Ahab returned safely from battle, then everyone present should conclude that Micaiah was a false prophet deserving of death. It was the ultimate expression of confidence in the word he had received from the Lord. But Micaiah was not content to let his challenge rest with the immediate audience. Looking around the throne room at the assembled courtiers, nobles and servants, he raised his voice even louder. "Mark it, all you people." It was a call to witness, an appeal to everyone present to remember this moment and test the validity of his prophecy against future events. The prophet was willing to stake everything, his reputation, his freedom, possibly his life, on the truth of what he had spoken. It was a level of certainty that transcended human confidence and entered the realm of divine assurance. As the guards seized Micaiah's arms and began to lead him away, the throne room erupted in a buzz of conversation. Some whispered among themselves about the prophet's boldness, others debated the implications of his vision, and still others tried to process the dramatic confrontation they had just witnessed. Through it all, the 400 prophets maintained their uncomfortable silence, uncertain how to respond to accusations that struck at the very heart of their prophetic claims. King Jehoshaphat watched the proceedings with deep concern. The righteous king of Judah had requested divine counsel, and what he had received was a prophecy that directly contradicted his military plans and predicted disaster for his ally. Yet something in Micaiah's bearing, some quality of authentic conviction, made it impossible to dismiss his words as the ravings of a madman or the spite of a disgruntled prophet. As Micaiah was led away, his footsteps echoing through the palace corridors, he felt no bitterness toward his captors or self-pity for his situation. He had spoken the word of the Lord faithfully, regardless of the consequences, and that obedience brought a peace that transcended his circumstances. The prison cell that awaited him might confine his body, but his spirit remained free, anchored in the unshakable certainty that he had been faithful to his calling. The cell where Micaiah was imprisoned was a far cry from the luxury of the royal court. Built of rough stone with a small barred window that provided minimal light, it was designed for punishment rather than comfort. The bread of affliction and water of affliction promised by the king proved to be exactly that. Meagre rations calculated to sustain life while providing a constant reminder of a royal displeasure. Yet in that dark cell, Micaiah found something that had eluded him in the freedom of his simple home. Absolute clarity about his purpose and calling. Stripped of all earthly comforts and securities, he was forced to rely entirely upon his relationship with the Lord. In the long hours of solitude, he prayed not for deliverance but for continued faithfulness, not for vindication, but for grace to endure whatever lay ahead. Meanwhile, preparations for war continued with increasing intensity. King Ahab threw himself into military planning with the fervour of a man trying to drown out unwelcome voices of conscience. He consulted with his generals, inspected his troops, and made elaborate arrangements for what he was determined would be a glorious victory. The prophecy of the 400 court prophets was repeated frequently, as if constant repetition could somehow make it more reliable. King Jehoshaphat, however, found himself deeply troubled by the day's events. The contrast between the theatrical unanimity of the 400 prophets and Micaiah's stark authenticity had left him with serious doubts about the wisdom of the planned campaign. Yet he had given his word to stand with Ahab, and the political implications of backing out now were significant. As the day of departure approached, Ahab made one final attempt to circumvent the prophecy that haunted his thoughts. If the word of the Lord through Micaiah was true, then King Ahab was destined to die in battle. But perhaps the king reasoned he could outwit divine judgment through human cleverness. "I will disguise myself and go into battle," Ahab announced to his commanders, "but you put on your robes." It was a cunning plan. By dressing as an ordinary soldier while Jehoshaphat wore royal garments, Ahab hoped to deceive the enemy about his identity and location. If the Syrians could not identify him as the king of Israel, perhaps he could survive the battle and prove Micaiah wrong. It was the kind of tactical thinking that had served Ahab well in political manoeuvring, but he was about to discover that divine judgment operates by different rules than human conflict. The morning of battle dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers across the plains surrounding Ramoth Gilead. It seemed an unlikely day for the fulfillment of prophecy, too beautiful for the tragic events that were about to unfold. The armies of Israel and Judah had assembled in impressive formation, their banners flying proudly in the morning air, their weapons gleaming in the sunlight. King Ahab, disguised as a common soldier, moved among his troops with nervous energy. His royal armour had been replaced with the simple leather and bronze of an ordinary warrior, and his distinctive crown was nowhere to be seen. To any casual observer, he appeared to be merely another commander preparing for battle, yet those closest to him could sense his underlying anxiety, the tension of a man who was trying to outrun a divine decree. King Jehoshaphat, meanwhile, wore his royal robes with obvious reluctance. The righteous king of Judah had agreed to this deception as part of their military strategy, but his conscience troubled him. The memory of Micaiah's words weighed heavily on his mind, and he found himself offering frequent prayers for divine protection and guidance. The Syrian army was formidable, well-trained and confident in their ability to defend their territory. Their king had given specific instructions to his 32 chariot commanders: fight with no one small or great, but only with the king of Israel. It was a strategic decision based on the understanding that killing or capturing the enemy king would effectively end the battle and secure victory. As the two armies faced each other across the field of battle, the air was thick with tension and anticipation. Horses stamped impatiently, armour creaked as soldiers shifted their weight, and commanders made final adjustments to their battle plans. In the distance, the walls of Ramoth Gilead stood as silent witness to the conflict that was about to determine its fate. The battle began with the thunderous clash of armies colliding, the sound of metal against metal mixing with the shouts of warriors and the screams of the wounded. Chariots raced across the battlefield like instruments of divine wrath, their wheels churning up clouds of dust that obscured vision and added to the chaos of combat. For a time, it seemed as though Ahab's strategy might succeed. Hidden among his soldiers, the disguised king fought with the desperation of a man who believed his life depended on remaining unrecognized. His years of military experience served him well as he wielded sword and spear with deadly efficiency, contributing to the initial success of the Israelite forces. But the Syrian chariot commanders were not easily deceived. When they spotted King Jehoshaphat in his royal robes, they immediately assumed they had found their primary target. A group of them converged on the king of Judah with deadly intent, their chariots cutting through the battle lines like ships through stormy seas. "Surely it is the king of Israel," they shouted to one another as they closed in on Jehoshaphat. The king of Judah found himself surrounded by enemy chariots, their occupants preparing to capture or kill what they believed to be their primary objective. In that moment of extreme danger, Jehoshaphat did what he had learned to do throughout his reign. He cried out to the Lord for deliverance. "Help me, O Lord," Jehoshaphat called out, his voice carrying above the din of battle. What happened next was a clear demonstration of divine intervention. As Jehoshaphat's cry reached heaven, the Lord moved the hearts of the Syrian commanders in an unexpected way. Something about the king's appearance or manner suddenly convinced them that this was not their intended target after all. "It is not the king of Israel," one of them declared, and just as quickly as they had converged upon Jehoshaphat, they turned away to search for their real quarry elsewhere on the battlefield. Meanwhile, across the chaos of combat, King Ahab continued his desperate masquerade. His disguise had served him well throughout the morning, allowing him to participate in the battle without attracting the special attention of enemy forces. For a brief moment it seemed as though human cunning might indeed triumph over divine decree. But the Lord's purposes are not thwarted by earthly schemes, no matter how cleverly conceived. As the battle raged on, a Syrian soldier drew his bow at random, not aiming at any particular target, but simply shooting into the mass of enemy forces. It was the kind of arrow that soldiers loose when they cannot see clearly, through the dust and confusion of battle, hoping to strike something useful, but with no specific intent. The arrow flew through the air with the invisible guidance of divine providence. It passed over the heads of common soldiers, sailed between the wheels of racing chariots, and found its mark with the precision of perfect justice. The bronze point struck King Ahab between the joints of his armour, penetrating the one gap in his defences that his disguise could not protect. The king felt the arrow's impact like a thunderbolt, the sudden sharp pain followed by the warm spread of blood across his chest. He looked down in shock to see the Syrian arrow protruding from his body, its shaft trembling with the force of impact. In that instant, Ahab understood with perfect clarity that no amount of human cleverness could circumvent the word of the Lord. "I am wounded," the king cried out to his chariot driver, his voice tight with pain and the dawning realization of his doom. "Turn around and carry me out of the battle." The chariot driver, a loyal servant who had recognized his disguised king despite the common soldier's garb, immediately began maneuvering toward the edge of the battlefield. But extricating themselves from the chaos of combat proved more difficult than anticipated. The battle had intensified throughout the day, and enemy forces blocked many of the potential escape routes. As they struggled to retreat, King Ahab's condition continued to deteriorate. The arrow had found a vital spot and blood flowed freely from the wound despite his attempts to stanch it. Yet with grim determination, the king remained propped up in his chariot, unwilling to let his army see him fall. His presence, even in his wounded state, served to encourage the Israelite forces and maintain their fighting spirit. The battle raged from morning until evening, the outcome hanging in the balance as both sides fought with desperate intensity. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed to mirror the blood spilled on the battlefield below, King Ahab's strength finally gave out. The disguised king who had tried to outwit divine judgment slumped forward in his chariot, his life ebbing away with each laboured breath. As word of the king's condition spread through the ranks, the cry went up that would fulfill Micaiah's prophecy with devastating accuracy. Every man to his city, and every man to his own country. The army of Israel, leaderless and demoralized, began to scatter across the hills just as the prophet had foreseen. Like sheep without a shepherd, they abandoned their positions and fled toward home, their dreams of victory dissolving into the nightmare of defeat. King Ahab died as the sun set over Ramoth-Gilead, his blood pooling in the bottom of his chariot. The man who had spent his reign choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths had finally encountered a reality that no amount of deception could alter. The word of the Lord, spoken through his faithful prophet, had been fulfilled to the letter. News of King Ahab's death spread quickly through the land, carried by the scattered remnants of his army and the merchants who followed military campaigns. In the palace at Samaria, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief. The 400 prophets who had proclaimed certain victory found themselves facing a crisis of credibility that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In his prison cell, Micaiah heard the news with a mixture of sadness and vindication. He had taken no pleasure in prophesying disaster, had felt no joy in predicting the death of his king. Yet the fulfillment of his prophecy served as a powerful reminder that the word of the Lord does not return void, regardless of how unwelcome it might be to human ears. When the guards came to release him from prison, Micaiah emerged into the daylight a changed man. His body bore the marks of his confinement. He was thinner, paler, and bore the lines of one who had endured hardship. But his spirit was unbroken, perhaps even strengthened by his ordeal. He had spoken truth in the face of overwhelming opposition, had maintained his integrity under pressure, and had been vindicated by the very events that had brought tragedy to the kingdom. The political ramifications of Ahab's death were immediate and far-reaching. His son Ahaziah ascended to the throne, inheriting a kingdom shaken by military defeat and spiritual confusion. The influence of Queen Jezebel remained strong, but the dramatic fulfillment of Micaiah's prophecy had dealt a severe blow to the credibility of the Baal-worshipping establishment. Zedekiah, the false prophet who had struck Micaiah in the throne room, found himself in an impossible position. His confident predictions of victory had been thoroughly discredited, and his authority as a spokesman for the divine had been shattered. The inner chamber where he sought to hide, just as Micaiah had prophesied, became both a physical and spiritual reality as he struggled to come to terms with the magnitude of his error. The other court prophets faced similar crises of confidence. Their unanimous declaration of victory had been revealed as the lying spirit Micaiah had warned about, and their reputations lay in ruins. Some of them quietly retired from public life, while others attempted to reinvent themselves as followers of different deities. None of them could escape the uncomfortable truth that they had been deceived, and had, in turn, deceived others. King Jehoshaphat returned to Jerusalem a wiser and more cautious man. His alliance with Ahab had nearly cost him his life, and the experience had taught him valuable lessons about the importance of seeking genuine divine guidance rather than accepting comfortable confirmations of predetermined plans. The prophet Jehu, son of Hanani, met him upon his return with words of rebuke for his alliance with the ungodly king, but also with recognition that the Lord had delivered him from the consequences of his poor judgment. Throughout the kingdom, people began to reassess their understanding of prophecy and divine revelation. The dramatic contrast between the false assurances of the 400 prophets and the accurate warnings of the solitary Micaiah had provided a vivid lesson in discernment. Many began to understand that true prophecy was not measured by its popularity or its agreement with human desires, but by its faithfulness to the word and character of the Lord. Years passed, and the story of Micaiah's stand against the 400 false prophets became one of the most remembered episodes in the history of Israel. Parents told it to their children as an example of courage and integrity, while religious teachers used it to illustrate the difference between true and false prophecy. The tale grew in significance with each telling, not because it was embellished, but because its lessons proved to be timeless and universal. The first and most obvious lesson was about the cost of speaking truth. Micaiah had paid a heavy price for his faithfulness: imprisonment, isolation, and the hostility of the powerful. Yet his willingness to endure these hardships had ultimately served a greater purpose, preserving the integrity of prophetic ministry and providing a clear example of what it meant to fear God rather than man. His story became a source of encouragement for future generations of prophets and faithful believers who found themselves standing alone against popular opinion. The second lesson concerned the danger of groupthink and manufactured consensus. The 400 prophets had created an impressive display of unanimity, but their agreement had been based on political expediency rather than divine revelation. Their story served as a warning about the seductive power of majority opinion and the importance of seeking truth, even when it contradicted popular sentiment. The comfort of belonging to the crowd, they learned, was no substitute for the sometimes lonely path of authentic faith. The third lesson was perhaps the most theologically complex: the reality that God sometimes allows deception as a form of judgment. The lying spirit that had influenced the false prophets was not an independent force, but an instrument of divine justice, permitted by the Lord as part of his sovereign plan. This aspect of the story forced believers to grapple with difficult questions about the nature of divine sovereignty and human responsibility, helping them develop a more mature understanding of how God works in the world. The fourth lesson focused on the importance of discernment in spiritual matters. King Jehoshaphat's initial uneasiness with the 400 prophets had been a manifestation of spiritual discernment, a recognition that something was amiss despite the impressive display of consensus. His request for a prophet of the Lord had demonstrated the value of seeking authentic divine guidance rather than accepting convenient confirmations of predetermined plans. The fifth lesson was about the ultimate futility of human schemes when they oppose divine purposes. King Ahab's elaborate disguise had been a clever attempt to circumvent prophecy through human ingenuity, but it had proven utterly useless against the sovereign will of the Lord. The random arrow that found its mark had served as a powerful reminder that God's purposes will be accomplished regardless of human attempts to thwart them. As the years passed and the kingdom of Israel continued its spiritual decline, the story of Micaiah took on additional significance. It became a benchmark against which other prophets and prophecies were measured, a reminder of what authentic faithfulness looked like in the face of opposition. When Elijah stood alone against the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, people remembered Micaiah's solitary stand. When Jeremiah faced persecution for his unpopular messages, the example of Micaiah's courage provided encouragement and precedent. The story also served as a cautionary tale for those in positions of authority. King Ahab's admission that he hated Micaiah because the prophet never spoke favourably about him had revealed the dangerous tendency of leaders to surround themselves with yes men rather than truthful counsellors. Future kings and officials who heard the story were challenged to examine their own relationships with advisors and to consider whether they were seeking truth or merely confirmation of their existing beliefs. In the quiet of his later years, Micaiah often reflected on that pivotal day when he had stood alone before 2 kings and 400 false prophets. The physical scars from his imprisonment had faded, but the spiritual impact of his experience continued to shape his understanding of his calling and his relationship with the Lord. The prophet had learned that faithfulness was not measured by immediate results, but by obedience to divine instruction. His warning had not prevented the battle or saved King Ahab's life, but it had preserved the integrity of prophetic ministry and provided a clear demonstration of the difference between true and false revelation. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest victories were won not through changing circumstances, but through maintaining faithfulness in the midst of difficult circumstances. Micaiah had also discovered that standing alone was not the same as being alone. In his prison cell, deprived of human companionship and comfort, he had experienced a deeper intimacy with the Lord than he had ever known before. The isolation that had seemed like punishment had actually become a pathway to greater spiritual understanding and strength. He had learned that the approval of the crowd was a poor substitute for the approval of the Almighty. The prophet had come to understand that his role was not to be popular, but to be faithful, not to tell people what they wanted to hear, but to speak what the Lord had given him to say. This understanding had freed him from the burden of trying to manage people's reactions to his messages, and had allowed him to focus entirely on the sacred responsibility of accurate communication of divine truth. The peace that came from this clarity of purpose was worth more than all the royal favour he might have gained through compromise. As news of Micaiah's faithfulness spread beyond the borders of Israel, his story began to influence other nations and cultures. Foreign dignitaries who visited the kingdom often asked to hear the account of the prophet who had stood against 400 false prophets and accurately predicted the death of a king. The story became a testament to the power of truth and the importance of moral courage, inspiring people of various backgrounds to examine their own commitments to integrity and faithfulness. The story also had a profound impact on the understanding of prophecy itself. Future generations would use Micaiah's example as a standard for evaluating prophetic claims, recognizing that true prophecy was characterized by faithfulness to the Lord's character and purposes rather than by popular appeal or immediate gratification. The account helped establish criteria for distinguishing between authentic divine revelation and human manipulation disguised as spiritual authority. In the broader context of Israel's history, Micaiah's stand represented a crucial moment in the preservation of true worship and authentic faith. At a time when the kingdom was sliding towards spiritual apostasy, his unwavering commitment to truth served as a beacon of hope for those who still sought to follow the Lord with integrity. His example encouraged other faithful believers to maintain their convictions even when they seemed to be in the minority. The story of Micaiah also served as a bridge between the ministries of the earlier prophets like Elijah and later ones like Jeremiah and Ezekiel. His experience of standing alone against popular opinion and suffering for his faithfulness would be echoed in the lives of many subsequent prophets who faced similar challenges. The patterns of persecution, vindication, and ultimate triumph that characterized his story became recurring themes in the ongoing narrative of God's relationship with his people. As we reach the end of Micaiah's story, we find ourselves confronted with questions that transcend the ancient world and speak directly to our modern hearts. In an age of social media echo chambers and manufactured consensus, the prophet's example challenges us to examine our own commitment to truth and our willingness to stand alone when necessary. The 400 false prophets of Micaiah's day have their counterparts in every generation. Those who tell us what we want to hear rather than what we need to hear, who offer comfortable lies instead of challenging truths. The temptation to join the crowd, to find safety in numbers, to seek approval rather than accuracy, remains as strong today as it was in ancient Israel. Micaiah's courage reminds us that faithfulness is not a group activity, but an individual responsibility. Each of us must decide whether we will speak truth or remain silent, whether we will stand for what is right or compromise for what is convenient. The prophet's example shows us that the path of integrity is often lonely, but it is never walked alone by those who trust in the Lord. The story also challenges us to examine our own relationship with authority and our tendency to surround ourselves with people who confirm our existing beliefs rather than challenging us to grow. Like King Ahab, we may find ourselves preferring the comfort of familiar lies to the discomfort of unfamiliar truths. Micaiah's example calls us to seek out voices that speak with authenticity, rather than those that merely echo our own opinions. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Micaiah reminds us that truth has a way of prevailing in the end, even when it seems overwhelmed by opposition. The prophet's vindication did not come immediately, and it came at great personal cost, but it came nonetheless. His example encourages us to trust in the ultimate triumph of truth, and to remain faithful even when the outcome is uncertain. In our own lives, we may face moments when we are called to be like Micaiah, to stand alone against popular opinion, to speak uncomfortable truths, to choose faithfulness over favour. When those moments come, may we remember the forgotten prophet who found his courage not in the approval of men, but in the approval of his God. The story of Micaiah teaches us that true strength is not found in numbers, but in conviction, that real courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what is right despite our fears, and that lasting victory comes not from avoiding conflict, but from maintaining integrity in the midst of it. As you close your eyes tonight and drift towards sleep, may you carry with you the quiet courage of Micaiah, the man who dared to stand alone because he knew he was not truly alone. May his example inspire you to speak truth with love, to stand for what is right with humility, and to trust in the ultimate triumph of God's purposes even when the immediate circumstances seem overwhelming. In a world that often rewards conformity and punishes authenticity, may you find the strength to be like Micaiah, faithful, courageous, and true. For in the end, it is not the approval of the crowd that matters, but the approval of the one who sees all hearts and knows all truths. The forgotten prophet's story ends, but its echo continues in every heart that chooses truth over comfort, courage over convenience, and faithfulness over favour. May that echo sound clearly in your own life, guiding you toward the kind of integrity that leaves a lasting legacy long after the voices of the crowd have faded into silence. Rest well, dear friends, and may your dreams be filled with the peace that comes from knowing you serve a God who honours faithfulness, rewards courage, and never abandons those who trust in him. The story of Micaiah reminds us that in God's kingdom, standing alone with truth is always better than standing with the crowd in deception. Sleep peacefully, knowing that like Micaiah, you're never truly alone when you walk in the light of divine truth.